Welcome back to our video life group sessions. We're still studying the book of Isaiah, and like I tell you every week, I want you to remember the two aspects, the main aspects of prophetic literature in the Bible. Forthtelling are messages that address the concerns of the prophet's own time. And then foretelling are prophetic messages that reveal future events. And as we talk about every week, we have three different themes running through the book of Isaiah. One is God's sovereignty, one is the Holy One of Israel, and one is servanthood. Now, before we start today, I want us, like we have been doing, to go over the things we've learned here in the book of Isaiah. We studied that God confronts His people because of their sins and their evil ways. We saw that God sends messengers for His people. In this case, it was Isaiah. God promises things to His people, and it's important that we trust Him to keep those promises. God reigns over everything and everybody. God saves His people. He has a sovereign plan to save us. God protects His people. God hears His people when we pray. God renews His people and provides strength for those who trust Him. God acts in the lives of His people to fulfill His purposes. So that's where we've been. Today we're going to look at chapter 49. In today's study, we're going to see how God comforts His people. The one true God is compassionate, and He comforts His people. In the scripture passage that we're reading today, Isaiah describes the Lord as the ultimate comforter of His people. He assured the people that they could find comfort in knowing that God had neither forgotten them nor had He forsaken them. The emphasis here is on trusting God. Even when things seem impossible and seem far away, people need to trust Him. Nothing else really matters by comparison. Well, what we're going to do is look at three phrases that kind of describe us as God's people. Now, these descriptions should be things that comfort us as we strive to live the Christian life today. And I don't usually do this, but they are a little different than the three things that are inside your student guide if you're following in the student life. But here are the three things. One of them is included in the call. And we'll explain these as we go along. The second one is called to follow. And then the third one is vindicated and restored. Isaiah is reminding the people that God was preparing the way for His servant when we look at this chapter in chapter 49. Through this servant, God is going to accomplish all His purposes and reward those who faithfully serve Him. And the verses we read today out of chapter 49, they comprise the testimony of God's servant. Now, here's what we see now that they didn't necessarily see then. The servant is presented in a way that finds its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus. So as I read those passages and as we study them, I'm going to teach in light of that idea that the servant is Jesus, and we'll see, and people will see that later. We see it now. They couldn't see that then necessarily. Let's read the first four verses together, and then we'll talk further about this idea of being included in the call. In the beginning of chapter 49, listen to me, all you in distant lands. Pay attention, you who are far away. The Lord called me before my birth. From within the womb He called me by my name. He made my words of judgment as sharp as a sword. He has hidden me in the shadow of His hand. I am like a sharp arrow in His quiver. He said to me, you are my servant, Israel, and you will bring me glory. I replied, but my work seems so useless. I've spent my strength for nothing and for no purpose. Yet I leave it all in the Lord's hands. I will trust God for my reward. I want you to look at this in the idea of two different parts. One of them is the servant's call to the people. All right? And so at the very beginning of this chapter, we see the servant called on people in distant lands and people who are far away. In other words, the servant was calling all groups of people everywhere. The servant's call to the people also asks that they listen and that they pay attention. It's not just hearing something, but listening closely and giving the message careful attention. We don't always do that. We don't always give careful attention to the things that people tell us, the things that we hear, but this is going to require careful attention. Many of Isaiah's prophecies were just for Israel, who are God's covenant people. But the messages about and through the Lord's servant extended the hope of salvation to all people groups. Now, when he talks in verse, I need to find it real quick, in verse 3, when he says, "You're my servant Israel," remember that we were told that the line of Jesus would run through Israel, and that's why we focus on that. But there was a servant's call. The servant called out to his people. But then we also see in here the servant's call from God. And if we're looking at the servant as Jesus, there are a number of things that we see about this call from God. One of them is that God called him before he was born. It means that God took the initiative to set the servant apart. This shows that the servant spoke and acted on God's authority. The servant had a special mission. The servant was known by God. The servant belonged to God. So he called him before he was born, but he used him as a divine messenger. He uses the phrase words of judgment. Even though the people are going to be looking for a military leader, this would not be the servant's mission. It wasn't going to be military. The servant would use God's words to bring about the deliverance of his people. He uses the phrase, "hidden me in the shadow of his hand." Although the servant was always part of God's plan, he was revealed only for a special purpose at an appointed time. And then he also uses the phrase, "I am like a sharp arrow." The servant was a unique and specialized arrow. He would be an effective weapon in God's dual-faceted plan of judgment and redemption. And so we see him as a divine messenger, but we see that God would be glorified through the servant. The servant described here would stand in for Israel and glorify God by doing what Israel should have done. He would reveal God's perfect character through perfect obedience. While God called the people to play a strategic servant role in his unfolding plan of redemption, ultimately that is going to be fulfilled by the suffering servant of Jesus Christ. So we see the call that God called him before he was born. God used him as a divine messenger. God would be glorified through him, and God would be in charge of the outcome. Regardless of people or time, the outcome should always be left up to God. The problems and solutions for Israel were up to God. Jesus' act of redemption for mankind, that was up to God. The problems and challenges in our lives should be up to God. We should give him all of those things. And so we talk about God comforting his people. There is comfort here in knowing that wherever we are, whoever we are included in God's call. We are included in his ultimate plan for redemption. It was true for Israel then, and it's true for us today. So we see the part about, we see us being included in the call, but when God called the servant to glorify him and save the world, he not only included the people of Isaiah's time, but he included each and every one of us today. But there's more to it than that. The servant of Jesus Christ was called to a specific task. We are called to learn from the servant and follow his lead. Let's read verses 5, 6, and 7. It says, "And now the Lord speaks, the one who formed me in my mother's womb to be his servant, who commissioned me to bring Israel back to him. The Lord has honored me, and my God has given me strength. He says, you will do more than restore the people of Israel to me. You will make a light to the Gentiles, and you will bring my salvation to the ends of the earth. The Lord, the Redeemer, and the Holy One of Israel says to the one who is despised and rejected by the nations, to the one who is the servant of rulers, kings will stand at attention when you pass by. Princes will also bow low because of the Lord, the faithful one, the Holy One of Israel, who has chosen you." I want to give you some important reminders here. This specific passage describes how God called and commissioned the servant of Jesus Christ. Jesus was not called just to restore the people of Israel, but to be a light to the Gentiles as well. That would include you and me. Jesus was called to be despised and rejected while he was on earth. Jesus was called to take salvation to the ends of the earth and to be a servant leader. At the end, Jesus was to be honored and respected as the one God had chosen to bring salvation to the world. But as I read through the verses, as I look through what's here, I find some things that were said of the servant that teach us some important lessons today. I've chosen 6 different words that call us to follow Christ, that call us to pay close attention to the servant of God. One of them is strength. You find that in verse 5. In verse 5, Isaiah says that God gives strength. God alone provided the strength Jesus needed to come to earth, to live as a human and to serve as a sacrifice for the sins of the world. Although we're not called to die for the sins of others, we are called to use God's strength to live for Him and to make a difference in our world. That's important. Another word I pulled out of here is Gentiles. No, I'm sorry, before I get Gentiles, I skipped one. Light. In verse 6, Jesus was called to save the world. And He was called to be the brightest light ever. And when Jesus was on earth, He said that we could do the same thing. He reminded us that we could be light in a dark world and that we could have an impact on the world around us. That's important. Now, the third world is Gentiles. That's also in verse 6. Jesus was sent to do more than restore the people of Israel. He was called to provide salvation to everybody. When the Gentiles were mentioned here, that means anyone who was not part of the Jewish community. Just as Jesus came to impact all people, we are called to follow that same thing. We're called to follow suit. We are called to minister to everyone, not just the people who look or think or act like we do. Another word I pulled out here, it's also in verse 6, is salvation. While Jesus was called to provide salvation to the world, we are called to tell people about that salvation that Jesus offers. We move into verse 7. I picked out the word faithful. Isaiah said that the faithful one had chosen Jesus. Jesus was always faithful to God and providing salvation to the world. We're called to be faithful in our Christian walk and faithful to the things that God expects from us. The last word I pulled out of verse 7 is chosen. The word chosen. Obviously, Jesus was the chosen one. He was chosen for a specific purpose. Now, we've not been chosen to be the pathway of salvation for others, but we are called to tell people about the chosen one and about the salvation that He alone can provide. So as we're looking at ourselves, we're looking at God comforting His people. There's comfort in knowing that God gives us everything we need to follow Him. So in the last section of the part that we're reading, it's not the last section in the whole chapter, but we're looking at verses 8 through 13 in the last section. Verses 8 through 12 renew the theme of the mission of the servant. God is the speaker here, and in these verses, the success of the servant is recorded as he continued to carry the work through the strength that God provided. So let's look at these verses. Let's read all of them. Beginning in verse 8. This is what the Lord says. At just the right time I will respond to you. On the day of salvation I will help you. I will protect you and give you to the people as my covenant with them. Through you I will reestablish the land of Israel and assign it to its own people again. I'll say to the prisoners, come out in freedom. I'll say to those in darkness, come into the light. There will be my sheep grazing in green pastures on hills that were previously bare. They'll neither hunger nor thirst. The searing sun will not reach them anymore, for the Lord in His mercy will lead them. He will lead them beside cool waters. And I will make my mountain into level paths for them. The highways will be raised above the valleys. See, my people will return from far away, from lands to the north and west, and from as far south as Egypt. Sing, O joy, O heavens! Rejoice, O earth! Burst into song, O mountains! For the Lord has comforted His people and will have compassion on them in their suffering. But look at kind of verse by verse, although I'll clump a few verses together here and there. Verse 8. In verse 8, there are 4 assurances given. One of them is that God would provide an answer when the time was right. We always have to wait on God's timing, even if we don't want to. The second thing is that God promised to help the servant on the day of salvation. And we see how God cared for Jesus. The third one is that God promised protection. And then the fourth assurance was that God would give His servant to be a covenant for the people. And we see that in Jesus. Out of those 4 assurances come 2 blessings. One is the restoration of the land, and the other one is the restoration of the people. When we move into verses 9 and 10, we see 2 different things at work here. One is the restoration for the captives. He uses the words prisoners, and he uses the phrase those in darkness. The real captives are those who are in spiritual darkness. A fundamental problem in the world is our ability as people, our people's inability to see the truth of God and their need for Him. That is, you see that throughout our society. People would be led out of darkness by the servant. But then in verses 9 and 10, we also see God's provision. We're told that God would provide a place for the flocks to graze, that the people would neither hunger nor thirst, that the sun would not scorch them, that God will provide mercy and lead the people. All those things are provisional. They're provisions for us. Whether that's physical or emotional, those provisions are things that God allows for us, that He has for us. When we go down into verse 12, we see that Isaiah says that people from everywhere, that they'll come from everywhere because of God's work of salvation, that's going to be something for everyone. Israel's role as the messenger of salvation to the world would finally be achieved through the work of their stand-in, who would be the servant of the Lord. That would be Jesus Christ. And then this section that we're studying ends in verse 13 with the call to worship God. I want to read it again for you. It says, "Sing for joy, O heavens, rejoice, O earth. Burst into song, O mountains, for the Lord has comforted His people, and He will have compassion on them in their suffering." Now, the different words and phrases used here. Sing for joy. Remember, joy is not, it's not a state of happiness. Joy is a lifestyle, a mindset. He says to rejoice. He says to burst into song. And then with this worship, look at the truths that are behind there. It says that God comforted His people. Now, the people had faced the consequences of captivity in Babylon, but would now see their day of deliverance and restoration. The other truth is that God had compassion on His people. In His day of salvation, God would vindicate His servant and the people who responded in faith to the servant. So when we talk about God comforting His people, we know there is comfort in knowing that God gives us assurance that He's always for us and the blessings that come from being His people. Every week we talk about lessons, and I threw some in, which each section I threw in a lesson, but let me throw a few other things out. That's stuff we can learn here. One of them is that God made it possible for everyone to have a relationship with Him. No one is excluded from the ability to have that relationship. Another thing we learn is that God gives us everything necessary to follow Him and to serve Him. We just have to take Him up on that offer, and we just need to cultivate that relationship. And He gives us what we need to follow Him. The third thing is that God can use each of us to help fulfill His purposes in a messed up world. You and I know the world's messed up, but He can use all of us. And then the last thing I wrote down that we could learn is even when following God is very difficult, there are assurances and blessings from living a life that is devoted to God. Those are just things that I pulled out of there. There are probably lots of lessons you could learn from this section of Isaiah. I'm just trying to help us see what some of them might be. But I hope that you're still learning things and looking at lessons, seeing things that you can apply to your life today. And I hope that we're seeing things that we can do to improve our relationship with God, because that's important. Next week, we're going to skip over a few chapters. We're going to go into Isaiah 53. And in Isaiah 53, we're going to see that God justifies. Because the one true God is forgiving, He justifies believers by taking their sin upon Himself. And we're going to look at that in that chapter when we get there next week. A few reminders: prayer with no intermission, the Bible study, Sunday, November 8th. I don't know when you're watching this, but Sunday, November 8th is the last study, the last session of the study with Pastor Bill Elliff. The sessions are streamed on Facebook. They're available on Sunday evenings on YouTube. If you've missed any of them, the first 5 are on the website now. And just remember that we're not meeting at the church, that these are digital. A prayer with no intermission, the 40-day prayer focus. So I've been trying to keep you on track. If you have the book, day 1 was on October 5th. So Monday, November 9th is day 36, which means that Friday, November 13th is the 40th day. So that ends the 40 days, in the book. But I also want you to know that the last of our 150th anniversary celebrations is coming up. Pastor Bill Elliff will be here on November 15th at 9 and 11 a.m. That morning, we're going to have a prayer breakfast in the Family Ministry Center from 8 to 8:45. And if you are interested in being at that, let the church office know. And that day also happens to be Shoebox Dedication Sunday. So if you are participating in Operation Christmas Child, which I hope every one of you are, if you'll get your boxes to the church, we will be dedicating them that Sunday morning. And of course, our Sunday morning and Wednesday activities remain the same. I hope you've enjoyed our study. Now, when we end Isaiah at the end of November, we'll be ending our video life group sessions. So keep that in mind. In December, you'll need to follow along in the learners' books that you give, or that you can get, or hopefully maybe you can come back on campus and study with one of our life groups. But I'll remind you all of that along the way. We still have a few weeks left before we do that. So let me pray for us, and we'll see you next week as we study Isaiah chapter 53. Father, thank you for your love, and thank you for comforting us. Thank you for sending Christ, Jesus Christ, to pay for our sins and to give us life and a relationship with you. And Father, as we continue to study Isaiah, I pray that we would continually find things that are meaningful to us that we can apply to our lives today. In your name we pray. Amen.